Dear viewers, welcome to the show POWERchat, Nepal's only TV talk show in English discussing developments since 2016. Through this episode tonight, we are discussing humanitarian emergencies amid COVID-19 with particular focus on transitional justice in Nepal and the fate of enforced disappeared persons. And I am joined by Mr. Jerome Imstepf, Head of Mission at International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC in Nepal. Let's talk. Welcome to the show, Mr. Imstepf.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Well, you worked in Nepal during the time of conflict back in 2006 with ICRC, I think in field office in Viratnagar. And now for last December 2019, you are leading the ICRC Nepal. How do you observe the post-conflict Nepal in relations to the transitional justice process?
Yes, as you mentioned, I already worked in Nepal back in 2006, so this period witnessed the end of the armed conflict in Nepal. So I could see this transition phase from conflict to post-conflict situation where Nepal is still today. When I say that 14 years after the end of the armed conflict that Nepal is still in a post-conflict situation, it is related to what we will certainly develop further, that the fact that a certain number of victims of the conflict have not seen reparation of the loss they suffer during this extremely difficult period. But in the meantime, there have been a lot of progress in Nepal. Let's not forget that Nepal passed from a civil war situation to a federal system within 15 years. So there have been a lot of changes, and part of these changes was also the setup of the transitional justice back in 2015, in which we are still involved in representing the family of the victims towards the government, actually not representing as such. We are in between. We are strengthening the bridge between the family of the victims and the governmental bodies that are in place to deal and solve all the post-conflict issue in Nepal.
Well, how do you observe all these progresses throughout these all years, 1.5 decades, the conflict ended in relations to the way transitional justice being moved ahead alongside the establishment of constitutional bodies like TRC and CIDP?
Yes, let me come back a bit in the past before the establishment of the commission. So before the establishment of the commission, the ICRC was in very close relationship with the National Human Rights Commission, which was in charge of this post-conflict file. And during that time, the initial list of the missing was over 3,200 cases. It is now around over 1,200 cases, but there has been some results. Some family managed to get to know the fate of their loved ones in this period. And then as a duty of the state of Nepal, the state of Nepal decided to create this transitional justice commission to deal with this issue. Again, it is, I would say, positive that the state is deciding to put in place such mechanism, because it is not happening in all post-conflict context. But it's been 5 years now, and as you know, there has been a little progress done for various reasons.
Well, I will come back to you on the issues you touched upon, especially that of the performance of these constitutional bodies. Being the largest humanitarian organization across the world and your presence here in Nepal, how are you coping with the current state of the global pandemic, COVID-19?
First of all, we are not as such the biggest humanitarian organization in the world, ICRC on its own. But if you look into the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement to which we are part, yes, this is the biggest humanitarian organization, the biggest humanitarian movement and network in the world. So coming back to the current crisis, the COVID-19 crisis, obviously it is a global, unprecedented crisis with a lot of humanitarian consequences. The ICRC is also a global organization working in over 19 countries across the world. So we had to immediately adapt our humanitarian activities and operation to this new situation, which means for conflict-affected area where our mandate fully applies, trying as much as we can to immediately reallocate funds and resources to support a civilian population living already in extremely complicated situation, notably in terms of access to health. So this has been done by the ICRC very quickly. The ICRC is an organization working in armed conflict, so dedicated to emergency operation. So that's why the institution could very, very swiftly switch some of these resources to the COVID-19 crisis. Mostly, and again, I come back on that, in conflict-affected area, because this is where our mandate applies. We don't have a mandate for this kind of crisis in general. In Nepal, what we have done is exactly the same. We have a limited presence in Nepal. It's been 14 years after the armed conflict, so the delegation in Nepal has reduced gradually since this period. What we did was exactly the same, immediately reallocate some of our funds and some of our resources, human resources, to support the Red Cross movement COVID response.
Well, Mr. Imstepf, you said that the process has been slow, especially that of the providing justice to the conflict victims. Could you also share the ICRC's documentation about enforced disappeared persons, their fate?
So I will again come back a bit in the past. So we have been following up these cases during the armed conflict itself. We have been recording cases of missing during the armed conflict, and at the end of the armed conflict, the first thing we did with the National Society as well, we revisited all the family of the missing and proposed to publish a list, a public list of the missing in Nepali media in order to acknowledge first the suffering of these people and possibly to get some news from the disappeared person. So at that time we had 823 cases. Then it went up to 2,300 cases. And actually, currently, we still have 1,300 cases to be followed up, which are the same cases that are dealt by the commission, the CIDP, so the commission set for the enforced disappearances.
So, do you think that the way cases have been documented by several organizations, including that of your own, the ICRC, they are able to provide justice to the families of victims here in Nepal? Often criticism comes from the families of the victims that justice has not been provided to them. They have been asking whereabouts of their loved one, dear ones.
Yes, absolutely, and the ICRC is a purely humanitarian organization, so I would like really to concentrate on the suffering of the families of the missing in Nepal. The ICRC approach towards the transitional justice and the commission, especially the one dealing with the disappeared enforced disappearance, is to have a dialogue in order to find a comprehensive humanitarian mechanism to reparate the loss of the victim of the conflict. The commission can be seen as a block, but we don't see it as that. Prosecution, judicial aspect, it is a must, absolutely. the wound will not be closed until the process will reach this stage. But we are seeing it in terms of pillars. So to us, the first pillar would be to give an answer to the family of the missing when the government or other bodies may have some information on the whereabouts and the fate of certain missing person. This is what we call the right to know. And again, this is the first thing that would able families of the conflict victims, of the missing person, to start closing their wounds. When you get to know the fate of your loved ones, you can enter, for example, in the mourning process. You cannot enter into this process until you get the information on what actually happened.
Well, very interesting insights, Mr. Imstepf. Would it be appropriate to say that the international principles of humanitarian laws have been ignored within the processes and initiatives here in Nepal?
As you rightly mentioned, enforced disappearance is prohibited under the international humanitarian law. This is a fact. But the mere fact that the government of Nepal has set up the Transitional Justice and the Commission, I'm not now talking about functionality or progress, but it demonstrates that the states of Nepal has been addressing this issue. So that's my position, our position as humanitarian, that we have to deal with the governmental body set up for this very purpose, and then our role to try to maintain a dialogue between the victims of the conflict and the Commission to trying to help this process to move ahead.
Why is dialogue not taking place in a proper way?
You mean the dialogue between the
victims and these constitutional bodies, as you are referring?
Because there are a lot of disagreements between the Family Victim Association and the Transitional Justice process. A disagreement first on the Transitional Justice Act, which is now being reviewed and amended, and it is in the hand of the Ministry of Law and Justice. So there were some disagreements on the base of the Transitional Justice Act, and also, as I was saying, what makes people, I would say, impatient is the suffering. It is the suffering of the person. And I think we can all understand if from one day to another your son, daughter, wife goes out of the house in the morning and do not come back in the evening, and then this situation lasts for weeks, months, and years, it creates a lot of distress. And distress, it's also prone, I would say, to conflict. Conflict within the family of the missing person, because having no news from someone, a loved one, for so long time, it can create anger. It can create, obviously, sadness. So all this, I would say, psychological impact is also impacting, to a certain extent, the dialogue between the victim association and the traditional justice, because there are misunderstanding.
What are your key suggestions overcoming these all challenges and providing justice to the victims?
Our key suggestion as ICRC, and I come back to what I was saying before, is try to find humanitarian mechanism first to allow the government to give an answer to the family of the victims, not necessarily with the prosecution aspect at the same time. Again, I'm repeating myself, justice and prosecution is a must. But I think if we keep this all together, that would maybe certainly hinder further the possibility for the family of the victims to get to know what happened to their beloved ones.
So ICRC is not in favor of blanket amnesty kind of thing?
Absolutely not. We are not, again, when it comes to the judicial process, this is in the hand of the government of Nepal. It is a post-conflict issue, so it is also a process of reconciliation at the same time. So it is up to the government and the people of Nepal to find common ground on how to address the prosecution side until the end. That's why there is amendment to the Transitional Justice Act, and this is why also the Supreme Court in 2015 rejected a government proposal to give more space for amnesty. So again, this is, I would say, a domestic process that are taking place, and the outcome of this process should be coming in a mutual agreement and understanding between the victims and the former perpetrators.
Do you have any suggestions to the government of Nepal implementing its commitments, providing justice to the families of victims?
I would say yes, and we are involved into that. We are an organization specialized in international humanitarian law, and this is part of our mandate. So of course, we do have experts into that. And in this kind of judicial process or transitional justice, the government and the ministries involved in the implementation of such process may be needing some technical support on implementation of international humanitarian law, for example. And this, of course, we stand ready to advise the governmental body in charge of those files in international humanitarian law, and also to advise on how to set up a mechanism that could integrate the principle of the international humanitarian law into the domestic law.
Well, Mr. Imstepf, you work with many state agencies here in Nepal, including that of the security personnel, in creating awareness about the international humanitarian laws and similar instruments that Nepal is a state party to. How do you assess the capacity of state agencies, especially that of the security sector institutions and judiciary, addressing and respecting the international humanitarian laws, that of your own mandate?
Yes, again, a very good question, and again, I will come back a bit in the past, because we are talking about international humanitarian law, which applies during armed conflict. So during the period of armed conflicts in Nepal, as in other contexts we are working, we are having a direct discussion with the parties to the conflict about implementation of international humanitarian law, but mostly respect of international humanitarian law, in order to try to prevent, I would say, acts against the international humanitarian law to happen during an armed conflict. And this part, we are keep doing it with armed forces across the world. Nepali army is also having a IHL session on a yearly basis with the ICRC, and this is what we call the prevention part. So this part, it's still there, so to sensitize government and security forces on the rules of war. And of course, peacetime, it's a good period to proceed to this kind of activities, hoping that this would be integrated first in the code of conduct of the armed forces, but also into national legislation. So this is an effort that we are continuing continuously to discuss with the government in order for them to integrate the international humanitarian law into their own legislative setup.
Well, you talked about establishing a humanitarian mechanism addressing these all, conflict time, abuses and violations, especially that of the enforced disappeared persons. Could you simplify it? What needs to be done establishing a humanitarian mechanism so that the current challenges are appropriately addressed?
Again, what I was saying before, what we consider a comprehensive humanitarian mechanism for the benefit of the conflict victims, it is a pragmatic measure that will address as soon as possible the first needs of the victim. This within a set of many other measures that this person should benefit from, justice being one side. What we are thinking in this humanitarian mechanism is that first and foremost, the family of the victim to be recognized as victim of the conflict first, and to get to know what happened to their beloved ones. This is to us the first pillar where we are concentrating. And with the recognition of a person or a family as a victim of the conflict, then they should be also able to get access to other type of assistance, be there legal assistance, be there administrative assistance, because let's not forget, when you are a member of a missing family, sometimes a simple administrative issue becomes complicated because there is someone missing without any official status, basically, because missing is not an official status as long as it is not recognized by the states.
How, hopeful you are that such mechanism would be materialized?
Yes, and of course, because we are keep on working on that, we are having a regular dialogue with the Conflict Victim Association and the Transitional Justice Commission into that. So what we are trying to do is really to maintain a dialogue on that and maintain our positioning towards that, hoping that at a point the Commission would be able to address this, I would say, first needs as soon as possible. And this is really what we are trying to do through a dialogue in a mutual understanding between the Family Victim Association and the Transitional Justice Commission.
Well, you also work with the civil society organizations on these issues. There is criticism that the civil society movement or civil society role has been weakened along these years. What is your observation about the role of civil society organization working for the implementation or awareness about international humanitarian laws and addressing the issues of enforced disappeared people here in Nepal?
I think also there is a time factor, and that is why we deem extremely important that organizations like us are continuing having this dialogue, because time passing, maybe interest of the general public may also decrease. And that is why we are continuing this work. And when you talk about human rights organization, Nepal has the National Human Rights Commission in place, which is doing a lot of work. The National Human Rights Commission, we are having a regular, of course, contact with them. They are really on top on their fight when it comes to human rights in Nepal. So I think it is very precious for a country to have such a commission in place. And as you mentioned, there are also other organizations working on human rights issue. For them, I cannot talk. Basically, I know they have been trying their best, but it is true for a certain organization, the level of involvement depends also on the general interest about an issue. And this is why, and I come back to that, one of our main role is to maintain this humanitarian dialogue on the missing person, even 14 years after the end of the armed conflict, in order this issue not to be forgotten, which is not the case in Nepal. I remember before the COVID-19 crisis, I think there was not a single week where I did not read an article in the main Nepali newspaper about conflict victim and missing. So it means that it remains a general concern for Nepali in general. And this is a good sign. This is a good sign because this would allow us to continue having a dialogue on an issue which is and should not be forgotten at any stage.
You know, everyone says that the commitment should not be forgotten, as you are also emphasizing on the same thing. But you are mentioning that it's already been 14 years, about 1.5 decades, that the interest, the demands of conflict victims have not been addressed. They have been simply asking about the justice. whereabouts of their loved ones. So we're coming to the end of the show as well. Do you have any specific suggestions to all key stakeholders here in Nepal so that perpetrators are booked or punished and justice is provided to the victims?
I would say, for the interest of the conflict victim, the transitional the transitional justice process has to go until the end and has to be concluded positively, which means that each and every cases recorded by the missing or other victim of the conflict would be, I would say, processed until the end, based on the Transitional Justice Act. That is a must. And again, our objective is that family of the missing get to know the fate of their loved ones as soon as possible. And this is really our objective for the months and years to come, to maintain this dialogue high on the agenda and hopefully to play a positive role in speeding up the process and finding ways together, I would say, with the Victim Association and the government of Nepal, to find ways to unblock, I would say, things that are preventing until now the family of the missing to get appropriate reparation for the loss they have suffered during the conflict.
Well, Mr. Imstepf, you shared with us a lot more interesting issues, many businesses that stakeholders need to do. Thank you very much for joining us. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you so much. It was an equal pleasure.
Dear viewers, time now to wrap up the show. Keep watching us. See you next week. Namaste.